Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the program. Sorry for the delay. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. We have a great show for you today, and it has been a whirlwind in the realm of geopolitics. So we're just going to get right started. And I just wanted to say first that the audience here, by a whopping 54%, believe that Donald Trump is for real about peace in Ukraine. And given the latest flurry of moves, this does not surprise me much. Trump has called Zelensky an unelected dictator who should have never have started the war after a delegation in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia agreed to reopen diplomatic channels with Russia and pursue normalization, including the possible end of sanctions ahead of a Trump-Putin summit. But what is motivating this huge change in U.S.-Russia relations? Is it genuine peacemaking or a prelude to something far more sinister? I have with me today geopolitical analyst and journalist of the Geopolitical Economy Report, BEN Norton. Hey, Ben, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me, Danny. It's always a pleasure being here.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, no, it's great. Thanks for joining me from Beijing. I know that it is early for you, but I wanted to begin, Ben, and let's talk about this because, as you know, things are changing quite rapidly with the United States and Russia now that Trump seems to be on a quote unquote peace offensive, I'm calling, and that is in quotes exactly. So I don't know, you've probably seen this. Hold on, sorry about that. You probably have seen this tweet or Truth Social post that has now been tweeted out by Donald Trump calling Zelensky a modestly successful comedian who took 350 billion US dollars, and now he's talking about how he is essentially an unelected dictator under martial law who refuses to have elections, is polling very low in Ukrainian elections. And I'm not going to read this word for word, but this is a huge shift, this rhetoric and approach. There was the summit in Riyadh that just ended with Rubio, Waltz, and Witkoff meeting with Lavrov and Russia's team. And there's also been media, and I'll just pull it up really quickly, of Donald Trump commenting on the situation with regard to Ukraine, where he says that it is not a Russian policy to call for elections in Ukraine, but a U.S. one. Here we go.
We're hearing that Russia wants to force Ukraine to hold new elections in order to sign any kind of a peace deal. Is that something that the U.S. would ever support?
Well, we have a situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine, where we have martial law, essentially martial law in Ukraine, where the leader in Ukraine, I mean, I hate to say it, but he's down at 4% approval rating, and where a country has been blown to smithereens. You got most of the cities are laying on their sides. The buildings are collapsed. It looks like a massive demolition site. The whole, I mean, so many of the cities. I mean, they haven't done it in Kiev because I guess they don't want to shoot too many rockets in there. They've done it 20%, but they haven't done it 100%. If they wanted to do it 100%, it would probably happen very quickly. But you have cities that are absolutely decimated. And yeah, I would say that, you know, when they want a seat at the table, you could say the people have to, wouldn't the people of Ukraine have to say, like, you know, it's been a long time since we've had an election. That's not a Russia thing. That's something coming from me and coming from many other countries also.
So, Ben, the question is, why is this happening right now, in your opinion? For me, what I believe is that Donald Trump definitely wants this conflict to end. How that happens, I think, is still up in question. But then why does he want it to end, and what happens from here? What's your thoughts?
Well, it's all about China, as is always the case. The central tenet of not only Trump's foreign policy, but also Biden's and in general U.S. foreign policy is trying to contain and weaken China. Unfortunately, we're in a new Cold War. And what Trump has been trying to do since his first term is what people call a reverse Kissingerian strategy. So in the 1970s, going back to 1971, Kissinger went to China, and then in 1972, Nixon went to China, and they normalized relations with the People's Republic as an attempt to try to weaken the Soviet Union. And this has been a call for a decade now. They want to do the same, but with Russia. They want to soften tensions with Russia, and they want to try to isolate China. Now, I don't think the strategy is going to work, but they've been very open about it. In fact, in October, Donald Trump did an interview with Tucker Carlson, and he said, China and Russia should not be united. He said, I'm going to unite them. I think I can do it. And if you listen to the speech that Marco Rubio gave in Saudi Arabia at this meeting, where he also was with, Mike Waltz, who's another hawk, he's a national security advisor, and they met with their Russian counterparts, including the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. In the speech, Marco Rubio said that the U.S. wants to collaborate with Russia geopolitically. I mean, a lot of people were surprised by this. They're like, wow, this is not just trying to pursue peace in Ukraine. The U.S. is saying we want to collaborate with Russia. But what is left unspoken is they expect Russia to go along with them to isolate China. China is, of course, Russia's most important partner. Putin is very smart. Lavrov is brilliant. They know what the U.S. is trying to do. And in fact, Putin acknowledged this when he was interviewed by Tucker Carlson. We all know that Carlson is very close to Trump. He's whispering in Trump's ear. And Carlson asked Putin about this in an interview they did last year in Moscow. And Tucker Carlson basically said to Putin, China's taking over. They're going to control you. They're going to control BRICS. And Putin said, this is a bogeyman story. He said, this is a fairy tale. It's not true. And he said, China's our neighbor. We have a long history going back thousands of years. They've never invaded us. And Putin told Tucker Carlson, which was really a way of him telling Trump, he said, you're hurting yourself by being so aggressive against China and trying to isolate China. So everything that's happening is about China. It's not about Ukraine. Ukraine is of no concern to Trump. I mean, we've seen that. And what we also have seen is that we now know who was really waging this war. So many people are angry that Ukraine was not invited, because we now know that, as you and I and critics have said from the beginning, this was not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This was a war between Russia and NATO, led by the United States. So this is why Trump is dispelling all illusions and saying, no, it's the US and Russia that have been in this proxy war, and we're going to negotiate now. Now, there are a few other elements I think we should consider here. Of course, the China element is the most important, but there's also what the US is doing to Ukraine, which is incredible. I mean, it's horrible. It's horrible. Obviously, the U.S. has been pushing Ukraine into the line of fire from the very beginning, and Trump blames Zelensky, but he really should be blaming the United States. It was Obama, and then Trump himself escalated the conflict in his first term, and then Biden. It's the United States that bears responsibility for this war, but of course, he just blames Zelensky. But it's not just that. Trump is now trying to impose economic colonialism on Ukraine. In fact, it's so blatant, it's so bad, that even the Telegraph, the mainstream British newspaper, referred to it as economic colonialism. What am I talking about? So people have been focused on the negotiations between the US and Russia, but Trump is also trying to force Ukraine to sign a deal that would give the US total control over Ukraine's minerals, and it has trillions of dollars worth of minerals. And we see, US politicians like Lindsey Graham have constantly said this openly. They say, we want to get the trillions of dollars of minerals in Ukraine. Also, this deal that Trump's trying to impose would give the U.S. control over Ukraine's oil and gas. It would give the U.S. control over Ukraine's ports and strategic infrastructure. And according to this U.S. plan, Trump wants to be paid back $500 billion from Ukraine. And he says that the U.S. needs to be paid back for all the money that it gave to Ukraine. Now, you and I have obviously been critics of all of the billions and billions of dollars that the US and Europe have flooded into Ukraine. But the total figure, including the US and all of NATO, all of Europe, is around 200 billion. The US has sent over 100 billion, but Trump wants to be paid back 500 billion. This is just mafia behavior. And he also, according to this plan, he wants to force the Ukrainian regime to sign a deal that says that 50% of all future revenues from the export of minerals and oil and gas will go to the United States. I mean, this is mafia behavior. And mainstream journalists have pointed out that if this deal were pushed through and Trump is demanding it, Ukraine will be forced to pay more to the US as a percentage of GDP than Germany was forced to pay in the reparations imposed in the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. And we all know what happened in Germany because of the Treaty of Versailles. Hyperinflation, the destruction of the economy, the end of the German Republic, and of course, eventually the rise of fascism. I mean, there's no shortage of fascists in Ukraine, but I mean, this is what the U.S. so-called ally, friend, does to Ukraine. It's amazing. I mean, this really gives truth to this famous Kissinger quote that being an enemy of the United States is dangerous. Being a friend is fatal. I mean, right. The U.S. has destroyed Ukraine. The U.S. pushed Ukraine into this war. The U.S. backed the coup in 2014 that overthrew Ukraine's neutral, democratically elected leader, Viktor Yanukovych. The U.S. pushed Ukraine into this proxy war against Russia. And now Trump says, give us all your natural resources and infrastructure. It's really incredible. And the real message you should get out of this, the entire world, and I think a lot of countries are, is that you can never trust the United States. Why would anyone in a million years trust the United States? And it's also why I don't think Trump will be successful in trying to get Russia to just break its most important partnership with China and put all of its eggs in the U.S. basket. It's never going to happen because Russia knows that the U.S. can't be trusted. Look what they just did to Ukraine. And of course, we know that, Putin has said this for over a decade. And when Putin came in, originally, the irony is that the West thought he would be a more competent version of Boris Yeltsin, who was just a complete clown and an alcoholic. Putin was supposed to integrate Russia into the West, but as an unequal partner, subservient. And Putin, as a nationalist, said, no, we do not want to be subservient. We want to be at an equal level with the West. And they refused that. They only were allowing Russia to integrate on terms that were against the Russian people, that were on behalf of Western oligarchs and Western capital. And Putin said no. And he gave his famous speech at the Munich Security Conference saying that, the U.S. is trying to seek hegemony and we need... You already saw kind of the early talk of a multipolar world back then, which is 15 years ago. So well over 17, 18 years ago now. So Putin has made that very clear that he knows the West can't be trusted. Trump thinks that he can just force every country to do whatever he wants because he thinks the U.S. has all this leverage. Look at the way he talks about, tariffs, saying that, oh, they'll do what I want. We'll control the Panama Canal. We'll colonize Greenland. We'll control Gaza. He overestimates the power of the U.S. He thinks it's the 1990s still. But what we really see is that, this is not about peace, really. This is about trying to end the conflict in Ukraine so the U.S. can focus on China. This is this is not just Trump. This is going back to Obama and the Hillary Clinton State Department's declaration of the pivot to Asia. They never were really able to pivot to Asia because then the U.S. waged all of these wars in Syria and Libya and Yemen and so many other conflicts, the proxy war in Ukraine. But now Trump is really saying, yes, we're going to end this conflict and we're going to move troops to the Pacific to prepare for war on China.
Well, it's interesting, Ben, because the audience here and I think many people are very hopeful. There are, of course, many who are critical, but there are many who are very hopeful about what is going on. And in many respects, I can't blame people for being hopeful because it's almost surreal to see the Trump administration behave in the way it is right now. You could say they almost looked diplomatic in Riyadh. You had for this press conference that, guys like Rubio, people that we have chewed up many times in the past, talking in a way where it was a script, but that script was being read quite well. And everything that the U.S. is promising to do, even just now, opening up diplomatic channels and whatnot, is what a lot of people want to hear, because a lot of people want this to end. But here's what Rubio had to say, especially about sanctions, that I would like your comment on.
Well, sanctions are all the result of this conflict. There are sanctions that were imposed as a result of this conflict. And so I would say to you that in order to bring an end to any conflict, there has to be concessions made by all sides. We're not going to predetermine what those are. We're not going to negotiate this today or in a press conference for that matter. But, and there are other parties that have sanctions. The European Union is going to have to be at the table at some point because they have sanctions as well that have been imposed. Well, sanctions are all the result of this conflict.
So, Ben, what would you say to people right now who are incredibly hopeful? On the one hand, I see this as an admission of defeat. Trump is saying it's Europe's fault. It's Zelensky's fault. He's laying it all. The Trump administration has been on an offensive against Europe, against Ukraine, saying it's all their fault. This should have never happened. Now we're going to get closer to Russia. And that, on the one hand, is a welcome development because of the aggression that the United States has been leveling toward Russia on the way toward a potential horrific confrontation directly. But on the other hand, there is this kind of distorted thinking of the U.S. as peacemaker. And I'm curious on how you would respond to those who are feeling very hopeful about this moment with regard to the Trump-Russia kind of reset that we are seeing, apparently.
Well, we shouldn't be naive. Again, this is all about China. Let's not be naive. Marco Rubio is not suddenly a dove. I mean, this guy has been a lifelong warmonger and neoconservative, and he simply has said that our main priority is not Russia, it's China. He said this for years. I mean, I recently did a video. I went back and looked at some speeches that Marco Rubio gave several years ago, and he constantly says, China, 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 China is our biggest threat. He said, China is the greatest threat the United States has ever faced, ever, he said, in history. He said China is a much greater threat than the Soviet Union was. Of course, the Soviet Union was never an actual threat to the U.S., but that's what they're claiming. And Marco Rubio's argument is that the Soviet Union was only a so-called military threat and a security threat to the U.S., whereas China, according to Rubio, is a so-called military, economic, technology threat, a threat in every single realm. And of course, China has the world's largest economy since 2016, when you measure GDP at purchasing power parity. China is the world's largest manufacturing power. Russia has a significant military force. Russia does have some advanced manufacturing capabilities, but China is just a whole other level. China's population is 14 times that of Russia. China's economy is significantly larger. China produces everything in the entire world. The entire supply chain is located in China. So the U.S., and especially people like Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz and Trump, are focused on trying to weaken China. And they've made the assessment that they lost. I agree with you. They lost the war in Ukraine. This is them acknowledging that. And they're saying that we need to end this conflict to focus all of our attention on trying to weaken China. Donald Trump said this in an interview with Tucker Carlson. He's not hiding it. This is very blatant. And ironically, in his first term, Trump wanted to do all of this, but it was Russiagate that prevented him from doing it, right? It was this ridiculous conspiracy spread by the Democrats that Trump was a Putin puppet. It's nonsense. He was never a Putin puppet. He said it very clearly. Steve Bannon said it very clearly. Even Kissinger, back in his first term, were saying, you should improve relations with Russia in order to isolate China. This is not about peace. The U.S. has never pursued peace. This is about imperialism. And Marco Rubio and Trump have a worldview that is about imperial spheres of influence. That's the way they see the world. Now, Marco Rubio gave this interview recently with Megyn Kelly, and in it, he acknowledged that the world is multipolar. And some Trump supporters took that out of context and claimed that suddenly Marco Rubio, this lifelong neoconservative warmonger, has turned a new leaf and supposedly is acknowledging that the U.S. can no longer be an empire. It's the opposite. If you listen to the speech, the full interview, and if you listen to other speeches that Marco Rubio has given, including in a video I did, I looked at a speech back in 2022 where he made the same comments about how we're in a multipolar world. It's not because he wants peace. When the U.S. talks about multipolarity, it's the opposite of what China means. When China talks about multipolarity, they mean a world without imperialism and hegemony. They mean a world in which all countries have equal opportunities to have their voice heard on international institutions and multilateral institutions. They mean a world in which all countries, regardless of size, are equal, and other large powers, imperial powers, cannot control and dominate what happens. For instance, what Trump is trying to do in Panama or in Mexico or in Greenland, right? And Marco Rubio's view of multipolarities is very different. Rubio says the US is no longer the unipolar power that it was in the 90s, which is it's not a controversial observation. Everyone knows that. The US can't control the entire world anymore. So Rubio and their conclusion is that the US must reassert its hegemonic control over its imperial spheres of influence. This is why they've been reinvoking the colonial Monroe Doctrine, which is already 202 years old. It's why they're so aggressive in Latin America, in Panama, forcing Panama to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to take control of the Panama Canal. They're trying to colonize Greenland. They're threatening to invade Mexico. They're even threatening Canada. They're now talking about colonizing Gaza. This is all about expanding U.S. imperialism, but instead of they're recognizing that the U.S. can't control the entire world. So they're saying Ukraine is an issue of Europe. The way they see it is Ukraine is part of Russia's sphere of influence. It's a European issue. It's not our issue. The U.S. is going to reassert its hegemony in the Western Hemisphere and in the Pacific, because they also see the Pacific as part of the imperial sphere of influence of the United States. So they're, again, going to focus on the pivot to Asia and trying to isolate China. And Trump says, I don't really care about Ukraine. The Democrats were, focused on maintaining U.S. full spectrum dominance over the entire world. That wasn't going to work. Our focus is imperial spheres of influence where we think it's most important to us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll pull up what Rubio said exactly in a recent interview with Megyn Kelly on this question of multipolarity. So here is the question, America first. This was a comment. And then he responds, and I'll just read what he had to say about it. He said, "It's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. It was a product of the end of the Cold War, but eventually you were going to have to reach back to a point where you had a multipolar world, multiple great powers in different parts of the planet. We face that now with China and to some extent Russia, and then you have rogue states like Iran and North Korea you have to deal with. So now more than ever, we need to remember that foreign policy should always be furthering the interests of the United States and to the extent possible, avoiding armed conflict and war, which we have seen 2 times, I would say that's an undercount, in the last century be very costly." But Ben, my question to you is, because in what I've been seeing is that Trump, in the Trump administration, all players, including people like Rubio, are saying and framing things in a way that I believe are leading people to the conclusion that they are genuinely for peace now. I think there's a narrative too that Trump has wrangled them, that they are now under his dominion and he is dictating what he wants them to do. And now, as you've seen in comments, I'm sure you've seen these comments, Ben, where he says, Russia, China, and the U.S. will all cut our military budgets together. We'll make China and the United States will have a wonderful relationship under me. This is Donald Trump. So how do you respond to that? Because, people want to feel hope, but at the same time, again, we are in the realm of rhetoric here. And is there a different reality that we need to be seeing?
Yeah, it's rhetoric. Trump, do people not know who Donald Trump is? He has, for decades, always said these bombastic things that never happen. He said, I'm going to make Mexico I'm going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. That never happened. He constantly says things like this. There's never going to happen. There's never going to be a deal in which the U.S., China, and Russia get together and agree to reduce their military budgets. And by the way, even if they all reduce their budgets, the U.S. would still be spending more than China and Russia and 7 other countries combined. I mean, because if they all reduce their military spending proportionately, the U.S. is still spending way more than them. It's not going to happen. It's just another thing that Trump says it's never going to happen. He loves to float out these kinds of things. I will say, I'm speaking to you here from Beijing, and from a lot of people I've spoken with in China, no one believes Trump on this rhetoric. They know that he's full of BS, and they're all preparing for more aggressive U.S. policies, more tariffs, more sanctions, more different attacks. We saw recently that the State Department under Marco Rubio removed text saying that it opposes independence for Taiwan extremists. So, I mean, they're preparing for conflict. The U.S. is preparing for conflict with China. And, people say, okay, well, Trump put tariffs on Taiwan. Well, Trump's putting tariffs on people everywhere. I mean, this is not surprising to me. Trump's worldview is a colonial worldview. Now, of course, all US presidents are imperialists. I'm not trying to say that, Joe Biden was a lesser evil, they're all war criminals. Biden was a horrific war criminal who should go to The Hague. And of course, Netanyahu is wanted at The Hague, but Biden should also be, because he's the one who armed Netanyahu as he carried out those crimes against humanity in Gaza. It's true for Bush, certainly, the Iraq War. It's true for Obama, the war on Libya, the war in Syria. But Trump is no exception. The people pretending that Trump is an exception are very naive, and they're believing his propaganda, which has always been fake. Look back at Trump's first term. He killed Qasem Soleimani, the top Iranian general. He killed a top Iraqi commander. He refused to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq. He boasted of stealing Syria's oil. He threatened sanctions on Iraq after Iraq's parliament voted to expel U.S. troops. They're still there. He expanded the war in Yemen and massively expanded U.S. drone strikes in Yemen. He waged a proxy war, an indirect war against Venezuela, trying to destroy Venezuela. There are so many things. He backed coups in Bolivia, a coup attempt in Nicaragua. It was very violent. Trump is not any different. His rhetoric is different, though. That is a difference. So other U.S. presidents, especially Democrats, love to talk about human rights and democracy, which is obviously bogus. It's PR, it's propaganda. Trump dispels all of that. This is why in his first term, it was Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, who famously said that Trump has taken off the mask on the United States and showed the true face of the U.S. And I agree. Trump is the true face of the U.S. empire. They no longer pretend to care about human rights and democracy. Trump is explicitly colonial. He doesn't hide it. He says, we are going to expand the territory of the U.S. empire. He said that in his inauguration speech. He invoked manifest destiny, which is a colonialist doctrine. He said repeatedly, including on the 25th of January at a rally, at an event in Las Vegas, he said, very soon we're going to vastly expand the territory of the United States. He wants to colonize Greenland, to take over the rare earths and very profitable minerals in Greenland. And also, when Marco Rubio, in that interview with Megyn Kelly, was asked about Greenland, what did he say? China, 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 China. By the way, in this speech that Trump supporters are quoting to claim that neocon, the king of the neocons, Marco Rubio, supposedly is now a dove, in that speech, he mentioned the words China or Chinese 65 times in 1 hour. 65 times. The entire interview, if you actually listen to it, which I did, all of it, and not just one little clip, the entire interview is about how the U.S. is no longer the only single imperial power in the way he sees it, and that he sees China as a huge threat to U.S. imperial dominance. So the U.S. must get involved in a great power competition, as he puts it, with China to weaken China. That's what the entire thing's about. He was asked about the Panama Canal, and he says, we have to control the Panama Canal because supposedly China controls it, which is not true. We have to control Greenland, as he says, to prevent China from getting access to the Arctic. He was asked about why the U.S. wants Greenland, and immediately he said, China, 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 China. This is not about peace. This is about expanding the U.S. empire's hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And Donald Trump, he issued an executive order praising William McKinley. And, a lot of people have talked about this because Trump's, he loves tariffs. He said tariffs are the most beautiful word in the English language. And in this executive order, he praises McKinley for his tariffs. However, if you read the full executive order, he also praises McKinley for expanding the territory of the United States. For Trump, this is very important. He wants to expand the U.S. empire physically, whereas previous presidents preferred having what's called an informal empire, right? Where the U.S. is a series of puppet regimes like the Jordanian monarchy, right? These obedient puppet leaders who will do whatever the U.S. wants. Trump dispels that and says, no, we want to directly colonize and control territories like Greenland, like Panama, like Gaza, and who knows what will be next on his list? Canada. He wants to make it the 51st state. So William McKinley, when he was president, what happened? He colonized Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Hawaii. And that's why Trump thinks he was a great president, because he expanded the physical territory of the U.S. empire. So Trump's view is that we have to reduce tensions with Russia. We don't want a war with Russia. And I don't think he wants a direct war with China, because people know that would probably be a nuclear war. So instead, his whole argument is that we have to get engaged in this imperial competition, in scare quotes, with China, where the US can just bully and colonize small countries that can't defend themselves because Russia and China can defend themselves. So Gaza can't defend itself. Greenland can't defend itself. Panama can't defend itself. So the US wants to take them over. But Russia can push back, and China can certainly push hard. So Trump is saying, okay, fine. We're going to focus on simply expanding our imperial power.
Yeah, and Ben, I've been thinking about this because these developments are happening so rapidly between the US and Russia. It appears, there will be a Trump-Putin summit very soon. Seems like the United States side is serious about proposing a kind of deal. Of course, it's doing so as almost like a external force for good, one that just kind of came in and said it's time to end the conflict in Ukraine. Look at you guys are killing everybody. Let's make a deal. That's kind of been Trump's thing. And then Europe, it's all their fault. Zelensky, it's all his fault. But at the same time, Ben, I wanted to ask you, as this is happening, there is also a meltdown because on the one hand, there is a component here that I agree with you that this could all be a kind of attempt to not just reorient the United States empire and imperialism, but also to lay the basis for a more effective war against Russia and China altogether. And here is
but Trump is saying we're not focused on weakening Russia. The way Trump sees it is Russia's not a threat. Read all the documents from the U.S. They all say the CIA director under Biden, William Burns, said this. They said Russia is not really a threat, only in the short term because of Ukraine. But they all recognize, they all say the same thing. China is the greatest so-called threat. This is bipartisan. Democrats and the Republicans say that. And Trump is saying, yeah, we're done with this whole Russia thing. Russia's not a threat. China is the so-called threat.
Yeah, no, totally. And the reason why I said that, though, is because it's very clear that there's plenty of people, plenty of elites, the ruling class that want to continue a war on Russia via Ukraine and elsewhere. And here is one example. I mean, the so-called neocons, especially on the Democrat side, are saying things like Trump is handing the world to China, that this is Xi Jinping's wet dream. And of course, people like Michael McFaul, who worked in the Obama administration as a so-called Russia advisor, is saying the same thing. He's saying, striking how marginal China is right now regarding peace talks in Ukraine. If Xi aims to rule the world, he's going about the project very slowly. So
go back to that for a second. That's the biggest if in history. If. It's a huge if you can get up that tweet a second ago.
Yeah, I'm going to get it up right now.
China does not want to control the world. I mean, this is such a stupid comment. He says, if Xi aims to rule the world, he's going about that. So if you invent this fantasy in your head, then China's not doing it well. China doesn't want to rule the world. They've said that so many times. China has not been involved in a war since 1979, whereas the US is at war every single day. I mean, China does not want to simply replace US hegemony with Chinese hegemony. This is why earlier I was stressing this point, that when China talks about multipolarity, it's very different than what Marco Rubio means. When China talks about multipolarity, they mean a world without imperialism, whereas Rubio says, yeah, we have great power competition.
Yeah, and the reason why I'm bringing it up, Ben, is it's obvious, yes, Trump does not view Russia, the Trump administration, this section of the ruling class, they don't view Russia alone as a threat. But it seems like this, for me, where I am going toward when I see a rapprochement between the U.S. and Russia, given that the United States is not going to give up its aim for full spectrum dominance, that there's a view that not only will rapprochement with Russia, help to divide Russia and China, but that it could also be just a total kind of trap, both for Russia, would weaken Russia maybe in some respects, if it was successful in dividing it from China, but also this multipolar world, which Rubio has even set out as saying this is a multipolar world. It could very well lead to the weakening of this if Russia takes the bait. What do you say to this? Because this has been a thought process of mine, given what you said earlier about the reverse Kissinger process. It seems like there's more realism here on the part of the Trump administration, but realism does not necessarily mean peace and a different set of relations. It could simply mean that there's a repivoting toward maybe what's more possible. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, you know who the most famous foreign policy realist in the U.S. is in modern U.S. history? Henry Kissinger. He is the most famous foreign policy realist. And in that sense, Trump is continuing in a similar path. So yeah, I agree. He's not following this. So in international relations, when people talk about the idealists, when they talk about the liberals, they mean people like Antony Blinken, who say we have this rules-based order and we must follow the rules that we created. Everyone else must follow them. And we're seeking to support democracy and human rights and the rule of law. That's, of course, very different from Trump's perspective, which is a foreign policy realist perspective, which is realpolitik, which is that the U.S. is a major empire. It cannot control all of the world, so it must admit strategic losses in places like Ukraine in order to focus on its main priority, which is countering China, period. I mean, if you really want to simplify everything, really, you would understand 90% of foreign policy, not 100%, but 90%, if you understand the basic principle that the most important thing, not only number one on the list, but 1 through 10 is weakening China, period. That's the priority of the United States, Republican or Democrat. Russia is seen as a short-term threat, but they're not really concerned about Russia, especially now. Their priority is countering China, which, as Marco Rubio said, is not only a so-called military threat, as if China's going to wage war on the U.S. It's a joke. China hasn't been at war since 1979. It's never going to happen. But they see China as a threat to not only U.S. military dominance, but technological dominance. That's why the U.S. is trying to ban TikTok and DeepSeek and Huawei. They see China as a threat to U.S. economic dominance, which is why they're trying to put tariffs and sanctions on China. They see China as a political and diplomatic threat, given that China has become closer and closer to countries all around the world. And, you know, in Africa, Biden was trying to do this ridiculous nonsense of like trying to bring countries in Africa over to the U.S. side and reduce their ties to China, and had this Africa summit and all this. I mean, it's all about China. And when Trump comes in, their approach to doing that is a bit different. But I mean, everyone you talk to in China, no one actually believes this rhetoric from Trump that he's going to be a peace president. Everyone is preparing in China for more aggressive policies.
Yeah. And, you know, you put on your X account, Ben, that there was, what was it? That there were, what were you talking about? You were talking about the various things that Trump could try to do to divide up, you know, Russia from China. And you said that it wouldn't work. What exactly, you know, because you said that Trump doesn't view Russia as a threat, but yet there's talk about economic cooperation. There's talk about ending the sanctions. And even Russia itself said that U.S. companies lost so much. Would the U.S. stand to gain here? Would this be more of, do you believe, like a not just a way to divide up Russia in the multipolar world, but also a way to gain a foothold? Like there's this understanding that, well, if they can get Russia in the U.S. camp, then the U.S. will be even stronger for all of these conflicts, all this aim toward China that you are elucidating here, because I still see this as a big problem for the United States' empire that, as you said earlier, how can it confront China in any significant way without bearing all kinds of costs, which we also saw under the first Trump administration with things like tariffs, for example. Major costs come from trying to wage economic war. So what's your take on the benefits of trying to almost like reabsorb Russia into the U.S. camp, and if that's even possible, because it does not feel possible given the balance of forces right now in the world.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen, especially with Putin in power. Now, if whenever there's a successor to Putin in the future, who knows? If there's like a radical shift and a more pro-Western leader comes to power, then it could certainly happen. But given what I said earlier about Putin's political trajectory, as someone who originally was brought in because he was assumed to be more pro-Western, and he tried to integrate Russia, but the West refused to accept Russia as an equal partner, so he pursued a more independent path. Putin is a very smart guy. He's not going to stupidly go along with this deal. First of all, he knows that Trump has 4 years. Whoever follows Trump could do another 180, just like Trump did with the Iran nuclear deal, right? So now Trump wants to pressure Iran to sign a deal with him, but I don't think that'll work either, because Iran has very smart leaders, and they know that if they sign this deal, how can they trust the United States? The U.S. already withdrew from another deal. So what Trump is continuing to show the world is that no one can trust the United States. And the only good thing about this is that what we're seeing is the relative decline of U.S. influence. Trump, the more aggressive that Trump is, the more he removes all illusion, all of the propaganda and PR about human rights and democracy, and shows the naked face of U.S. imperialism and the hard fist of U.S. imperialism. It's showing many other countries, including in Europe, that the U.S. can't be trusted and they have to diversify their international relations. In that sense, I have almost no confidence whatsoever in Europe and the European leadership. They're entirely subservient to the U.S. So even though Trump and J.D. Vance are spitting in their face, they're just going to say, okay, thank you, Uncle Sam. Please ask me what you want. But there are people saying that Europe may reposition itself and move more toward China. If they were smart, they would do that. If it's not just a matter of being smart. I mean, this is speaking in terms of like a liberal understanding of the world. It's also economically, Europe is totally subordinated to the United States. Militarily, they have no independent policy. When Trump was president the first time, this is why Germany under Angela Merkel and France under Macron, this is why they were talking about creating a pan-European standing army. And people joked that they laughed at the idea at the time. I actually think it would be a great idea. They should do that because it's the only way that they could actually be independent of the United States. As long as economically Europe is dependent on the US and militarily dependent on the US, they will never be able to pursue this independent foreign policy. But Trump, by being so openly aggressive, he's showing the rest of the world that they have to diversify their relations. They can no longer depend on the United States, which is actually, in a perverse way, a good thing. Now, as for the sanctions and what the U.S. can offer, the U.S. cannot offer Russia very much, which is why, again, it's not just a matter of individual leadership. I mean, this is like a liberal worldview that IR scholars love to talk about individual leaders. And I'm not saying that they're insignificant. Obviously, Trump is an example, right? Like Trump is markedly different from previous U.S. presidents. Even though there is a lot of continuity, there are things that are very different. And similarly, Putin is a figure like that as well. But looking past the individual leaders, you have to look at the macroeconomic conditions. I already talked about the military alliances and the dependencies there. But economically, Russia and China have a deep partnership. It's not just political. Russia and China have a very complementary economic relationship. China is the world's leading manufacturing power, and it produces everything that Russia wants and needs. Russia has all of the minerals and natural resources and oil and gas that anyone could want. And Russia also has certain very advanced manufacturing capabilities that China is still behind in, especially in things like military technology, right? So they have a very complementary economic relationship. What can the U.S. offer Russia that China can't? Nothing. Well, sanctions relief, that's it. But ironically, as difficult as the sanctions have been for Russia, they've actually made, in the short term, there's been a lot of pain. But in the medium to the long term, there will be a lot of gain in Russia because Russia has become more independent and no longer as dependent on the West. Now, economically, Russia was never very dependent on the U.S., but Russia had despite all of the political issues, it had a very important trading relationship with Western Europe, especially gas and oil, right? Look at what's happening in Germany, the de-industrialization of Germany. And, J.D. Vance goes to the Munich Security Conference and he spits in the face of Germany and tells them that they're stupid for deindustrializing, not mentioning that the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, that the U.S. sabotaged Germany's relationship with Russia. And I get that, yeah, they blame the Democrats or whatever, but they're the U.S. government. You can't just ignore what your government has done for decades and suddenly say we have nothing to do with it, which is what J.D. Vance is trying to do. I mean, the U.S. is responsible for deindustrializing Germany. And I mean, of course, German leadership is responsible as well. I'm not saying it's only the U.S. There's a lot of horrible leadership in Germany. But the point is that the U.S. can't really offer Russia very much. The U.S. can give them sanctions relief, but the sanctions have made Russia more independent, and they have deepened Russia's economic integration with Asia, and not only with China. Of course, China is Russia's largest trading partner, but India has become an even more important trading partner for Russia. And of course, India and China are in BRICS. And also Turkey, which is interesting. Turkey's constantly playing multiple sides. Turkey is part of NATO, but they say they want to join BRICS. So Turkey's another country. It's very complicated. But Turkey's become another very important trading partner of Russia. So the sanctions, as difficult as they've actually kind of been good in some ways for Russia, in the sense that they've made the economy more reliant, more self-sufficient, more independent. And now the U.S. says they're offering sanctions relief. Well, I think Russia has already gotten past the worst years of the sanctions. By the way, the sanctions don't just go back to 2022. They go back to 2014 with the U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine and then the conflict over Crimea and in the East and the Donbass and all of that. So Russia's had 11 years now of sanctions. Its economy has reoriented in many different ways. So the U.S. says, okay, they're going to offer you sanctions relief. Okay, that's basically a non-starter because, I mean, Russia would require that as a bare minimum is sanctions relief, bare minimum. And secondly, the U.S. can offer security guarantees. Now, obviously, yes, this is something that's very important for Russia, but Ukraine has been militarily defeated. I mean, Trump says he's going to withdraw U.S. troops from the Baltic states. But is anyone really thinking that Estonia is going to threaten Russia? I mean, come on, let's be serious. They do not see the Baltic states as a threat. Ukraine was very different. When Russia was invaded, when the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany in World War II, they went through Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has always been a key strategic vulnerability for Russia with the massive border they share, especially trying to cut off Russia from the Black Sea and from the Caucasus, cut off southern Russia from European Russia. So
and a massive
Ukraine
military too. I mean, to be truthful, I mean, it has a massive military that the United States fortified since the coup. I mean, it's a real threat. And so you have Article 5, and if Article 5 is triggered, then that's a real threat for Russia. But continue.
No, of course. I mean, security guarantees are important, obviously, for Russia. This is what this whole thing's about, basically, this whole conflict. But what I'm getting at is that Russia would very much like U.S. security guarantees, but it's not going to sacrifice its own interests for these security guarantees because Ukraine's military has been destroyed. I mean, it very much wants security guarantees, but at the end of the day, if Trump makes all these unreasonable demands and says you have to cut ties with China and all this, Russia's not going to stupidly do that because its relationship with China is more important. So the point I'm getting at here is that Trump thinks that the U.S. has all of these cards it can play. And like I said, that has two main cards, sanctions relief and security guarantees. But for Russia, those are bare minimums. Like its relationship not only with China, but with Asia, with BRICS, is much more important at this point, which is why maybe it could have been possible in Trump's first term to have some kind of great deal, which is what he wanted to do, but Russiagate prevented him from doing that. It could have been possible then, but it's been a decade since. The world has really changed a lot in the past decade. And the leadership in Russia, don't get me wrong, there are some people in Russia, I've heard this in China, there are people in Russia who are very anti-China and pro-West. Yep. Putin is not one of those people, but there are people in the Russian government who believe that, especially now they think that, Trump's in and that other like far right parties in Europe will come in who will be more friendly to Russia. But Putin and the senior leadership of Russia, I think they recognize that the West is basically lost at this point and that their future lies in deepening their integration with Asia, which, this is the future of the world economy in particular. It already is the majority of the world population is in Asia, and the majority of the economy is already in Asia, but it's going to just continue to grow.
Yeah, and Pepe Escobar was on this show, and I don't 100% agree with him on this, but I do agree with the overall position that sanctions have facilitated Russia's ascendance as a leader in BRICS. He says the leader. I don't know if I'm convinced. I believe China's economic role cannot be understated, but Russia.
Well, the whole point of
has,
BRICS is there's not one leader. That's the whole point of it.
But in terms of the influence of Russia and China and their policies, they obviously play a focal point in facilitating that exact process that you said, that a mechanism that isn't led by great powers, but that brings together the multipolar world to develop. So with that said, Ben, you said the world has changed. Let's talk about this, because it's quite clear that the Trump administration is responding a lot to this changing world. They're saying, I mean, it's surreal to hear, even if the vision is different from ours, especially Marco Rubio talking about multipolarity as being almost like a great power competition. I don't think China and Russia see it this way at all. But at the end of the day, it is quite clear that Trump, Rubio, all of his people, they have a tracked mind on this changing world. So talk about BRICS, because Donald Trump is a little confused about BRICS too, and I want to play a clip as you're talking about it, because he did not know that China was in BRICS. He also thought Spain was in BRICS. So comment on this changing world and how it is influencing Trump's foreign policy in particular, but also just U.S. foreign policy in general, because I think that there's a lot of emphasis right now on Trump, the person, Trump, the individual. But Trump, to me, is a byproduct of changing conditions. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, like I said, it's uncontroversial at this point that the world is multipolar. In fact, it's become so uncontroversial that the Munich Security Conference just published their annual report for 2025, and it's titled Multipolarization. So, I mean, again, it's no longer radical to say we're in a multipolar world. However, as I keep emphasizing, what the US and the Munich Security Conference mean by multipolar is very different from what China and much of the global South mean by multipolar. So, for instance, in Latin America, for years now, many of the anti-imperialist leaders in the region have talked about multipolarity. President Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, the leader of the Sandinista revolution, has emphasized that his view of multipolarity is a world beyond imperialism, defeating imperialism. But of course, the US has the opposite view. They see, okay, we can no longer control the entire world, so we must reassert US imperialism in Latin America. So they're using the same word, but they have the exact opposite meanings. So in terms of Trump's threats against BRICS, this is a clear example of what I'm talking about, that Trump has these completely contradictory views in the world. So for instance, Trump says that he wants to bring down the US dollar to reindustrialize, but his tariffs, everything he's doing, especially his tariffs, are strengthening the US dollar. Trump says that he wants to, he says that he doesn't want the US to run these massive trade deficits, these current account deficits, which are needed to maintain the US dollar system, because the whole point of the dollar system that was created at the end of World War II is that the US provides other countries with the liquidity, with the dollars they need in order to trade and do investment in dollars. You obviously can't trade with dollars if you don't have dollars. And in order to get those dollars, the US has to run a trade deficit. But then Trump says he wants to end the trade deficit. But then Trump also says that he wants to threaten countries that de-dollarize with 100% tariff. So, I mean, Trump has this completely contradictory worldview where he believes totally contradictory things that make no sense. And this gets us to BRICS. Trump has repeatedly threatened 100% tariffs on BRICS. Does he know that Russia's in BRICS? Because now Marco Rubio says they want to economically collaborate and geopolitically collaborate with Russia. So are they going to put 100% tariffs on Russia or not? I don't get it. Like, it's totally contradictory. Now, you also mentioned that Trump is very ignorant. He didn't even know that China was in BRICS. Obviously,
and I can
China
play that
is the
really
seat in
quick.
BRICS.
I'll play that really quick. Here's what he had to say.
BRICS, the BRICS nations, I think that's breaking up very rapidly. We said that if they're going to go and do anything to undermine the dollar, that includes China. I don't even know that they're a member of BRICS, but they had a few nations get together to try and play cute. And I said, we're going to put 100% tariff on every one of those nations. And at the mere thought of saying that, I think that's all broken up. That idea has no longer sailed. Now, that would be a terrible thing for our country. It would be bad for the world. They wanted to undermine the dollar.
Ben, so not only does he not know China's in BRICS, but he also believes BRICS has been defeated. Continue.
Yeah. So he made those comments also when Prime Minister Modi of India was visiting Washington. And at a similar press conference, that was not the same press conference, but one around the same time, an Indian journalist asked Trump, because obviously India is the I in BRICS. I don't know if Trump knows that. He didn't know that China is the C in BRICS. I don't know if he knows what BRICS stands for. Who knows? But anyway, the point is that this Indian journalist from a media outlet that is very pro-Modi. I mean, a lot of the media in India is owned by a bunch of oligarchs who are all very close to Modi. So, and they're in BRICS. So they were concerned about Trump's threats. And this journalist asked Trump, he said, well, you know, Modi's visiting. You have a good relationship with India, but you're threatening tariffs on BRICS. Like, you're threatening tariffs on us. Do you recognize, like, are you going to put tariffs on India? And then Trump went in this whole long thing about how BRICS is dead. He said that. He said BRICS is dead, which obviously BRICS is not dead. It's the exact opposite. Not only is BRICS not dead, BRICS is constantly expanding every few months. Earlier this year, 2025, BRICS added Indonesia as a full member, which is one of the most populous countries on earth with one of the largest economies. And they added that. So Indonesia is now a full member. There are now 10 full members of BRICS. And they added Nigeria, which is the most populous country in Africa, as a partner of BRICS. BRICS now represents 55% of the world population, over half of the world population, and 42% of global GDP measured at purchasing power parity. So it's the opposite of dead. And again, this is why it's really hard to predict what Trump will do, because he's so contradictory. He says that he wants to weaken the dollar and reindustrialize, but then he threatens countries that de-dollarize with 100% tariffs. So, I mean, I don't know. The fact that he thought that Spain was in BRICS, I think he thinks that BRICS is like the Warsaw Pact. Like, I really don't think he knows what BRICS is. But the whole point is that, as we were talking about a moment ago, the view that BRICS has of the world is totally different from the US view. And this is not just Republicans, Democrats as well. I mean, this imperialist hegemonic worldview in BRICS, they have a view that's very similar to the non-aligned movement. If I had to compare BRICS to an organization, it would be to the non-aligned movement during the first Cold War, right? And BRICS, what are the two goals of BRICS? Every year there's a rotating chair. The chair this year is Brazil. And they constantly, in all of their statements, they stress that BRICS has two main goals. One, to deepen South-South cooperation. And Russia is now, an honorary member of the Global South. It's been kicked out of the West. And now Trump's trying to bring it back into the West. But like I said, I don't think that's going to, Russia will, of course, they'll accept sanctions relief and a security guarantee, but they're not going to break off their relationship with China and BRICS, at least in the short term, as Putin's president. We'll see what happens in the future in Russia. But so that's the first goal, deepening South-South cooperation. The second goal of BRICS is reforming global governance institutions. That's the language they use. What does that mean? Reforming the United Nations, reducing the impact of Western countries that have total chokehold on the UN. It means reforming international financial institutions, which are dominated by the US. The US has veto power in the IMF and the World Bank. The US has destroyed the World Trade Organization. If they can't reform them, it means creating new institutions. So BRICS is not an attempt to replace US hegemony with Chinese and Russian hegemony. The point of BRICS is that they're actually seeking a multipolar world that doesn't mean new imperialist powers. It means a world in which all countries, regardless of size, have an equal representation in multilateral institutions, which obviously the US will never tolerate.
Yeah. I mean, earlier you said that Russia, like for Russia, security guarantees are a bare minimum. Uh, and I believe they're a bare minimum too, because how can you get to this project of multipolarity and also a building for Russia and China? I feel like for all countries who are trying to develop independently, peacefully, uh, this is a bare minimum. And so Russia has actually been very clear as these talks with all the enthusiasm around them. They've been very clear from Maria Zakharova to Sergei Lavrov. They've all been saying, no, there are things that are unacceptable. Like NATO will have to get rid of its Ukraine pledge, which is, I don't know if that's possible because Trump at the same time is scuttling NATO and, moving away and making NATO almost this like independent European entity that is doubling down on this rhetoric. So all this is to say, Ben, is, there is this very interesting phenomena when it comes to what the Trump administration is doing right now. On the one hand, it is pivoting toward China, toward a kind of reorientation, Latin America, maybe Western Hemisphere, as you said, but also by cutting off its traditional vassals and allies, so to speak, quote unquote. To me, that seems to be seeding a lot of what makes the U.S. empire or U.S. imperialism. So I'm curious on your thoughts on this, because how do you feel like the multipolar world, BRICS, is looking at this trend right now as the U.S. shifts into Trump-led foreign policy? Because, as you said, it is different, even though there is this major continuity amid shifting priorities.
Yeah, well, if you go back to Trump's first term, David Petraeus, the former CIA director, famously said, when asked about Trump's foreign policy, he said, this is an exact quote, "There is more continuity than change," end quote. And I think that, in this term, maybe Trump is a little more different, but I think there's still a lot of similarities. The main difference, of course, is Ukraine and Russia. But look at Biden's foreign policy regarding China. It was very aggressive, and Trump's foreign policy regarding China is also going to be very aggressive. Let's not forget that we're 1 month. Today is the 20th. We're exactly 1 month. Well, I guess it's the 20th here. It's the 19th there. We're 1 month into Trump's presidency. There's a long, long, long way to go. And I expect, and everyone I've talked to in China, and there are a lot of disagreements in China about many different issues, but the scholars focused on international relations and economic policy and all this, they're all expecting a very aggressive policy from Trump. Now, I'm not saying that they all expected something better from Biden. The whole point is that they know that the U.S. is only going to be more aggressive against them, regardless of the leader. And the famous term that was used here in China in the lead up to the U.S. elections was choosing between Biden and Trump, or choosing between Trump and Kamala Harris, the Republicans and Democrats, is like choosing between two bowls of poison. They recognize that the U.S. is on this path toward more and more conflict with China. And that's not exactly the same strategy under the Democrats and the Republicans, but it's mostly the same. Now, what about other parts of the world? We're in this increasingly multipolar world. Like I said, the fact that Trump is now openly threatening Panama, Greenland, Gaza, Mexico, Canada, many other places, I think this is also showing other regions of the world. We talked about Europe, but also many countries in Africa, some in Latin America, and some even in Asia, including even in East Asia, that they need to reconsider their dependency on the U.S. And that's just, it could be kind of good. I mean, the point is that when empires become too overtly aggressive, they end up weakening themselves because they force countries that were on the fence and trying not to draw attention to themselves to diversify their relations. And we even see discussions of this in South Korea. We saw that Yoon Suk Yeol, this very far-right leader of South Korea, he tried to do a military coup. He tried to assassinate his opposition, and he completely failed. And now it's likely that the opposition will come to power. And the opposition in South Korea is more friendly to China. And they're talking about improving their relations with China and being less dependent on the United States, because they can see what Trump is doing in Europe and they say, well, we could be next, so we should be improving our relations with China. That's obviously a good thing. Even in Japan, I mean, I think Japan will be the last country that would ever do this, but even in Japan, there are whispers now about this possibility of improving relations with China because they don't know what will happen in the US. So Trump is, he's so similar in a lot of ways to Nixon. There are ways in which Trump is unique, but Trump is like a combination between Reagan and Nixon. So he has a lot of the economic policies of Reagan, just turbocharged neoliberalism, slashing social spending, cutting taxes on the rich, while giving big subsidies to Elon Musk's companies. But at the same time, he has a lot of Nixon's kind of foreign policy sensibilities, right? So Nixon was a realist. Kissinger was his national security advisor. And Nixon also had this idea of the madman theory, right? That you just be completely crazy and other countries will fear you. And because they fear you and don't know what you will do, you can use that as leverage to pressure other countries to do what you want. Well, yeah, that only works insofar as countries don't pursue alternatives because they don't think they can trust you. And I think what's actually happening is this madman strategy is kind of backfiring. And instead of other countries only fearing the US, because they do fear the US, they're simply saying that we can't trust the US anymore and we have to find some kind of alternative. But again, I mean, I think the last region that will be able to do that is Europe. Europe is so completely dependent on the US that I don't think it's going to happen. But, we're talking about BRICS and the global south, which again represents the global majority, 86% of the world population. And a lot of countries in Asia, Africa, and some in Latin America are saying that, yeah, we really need to seek alternatives.
Yeah. In Europe, if it were smart, it would jump on this bandwagon. I mean, we saw Italy walk out of the Belt and Road Initiative. If Europe were smart, it would move in this direction rather than doing what it's doing now, which is, having this, I don't know what you call it, this gathering in Paris, talking about we're going to spend all of the money the U.S. was spending on Ukraine, and we're going to continue to fight the war until there's a peace deal. And if there's a peace deal, we'll probably just bow to the United States and let the United States do whatever it wants to us. Ben, I wanted
one quick note. We're talking about the European leadership. And, I mentioned that it's not just individual personalities and leaders, right? It's also the military dependency on the U.S., the economic relations and integration with the U.S. Now that Europe has replaced cheap Russian pipeline gas with expensive U.S. liquefied natural gas, U.S. LNG.
Yeah, it's over. I mean,
all of that.
It's over. Yeah, exactly.
But it's actually even deeper than that. It's also that the European capitalist class has been almost entirely become a European comprador bourgeoisie. So look at a country like, for instance, Germany. You still do have some German industrialists, and they were the ones actually who were pushing for deepening integration with Russia because they wanted to get cheap Russian pipeline gas. So it was Angela Merkel, the representative of the German industrialists. I mean, she was not a left-wing leader. She was a center-right conservative leader. But she said, look, we have to integrate more economically with Russia because German industry needs cheap energy. Well, increasingly what we've seen is with the deindustrialization of these countries, the European capitalist class has become more and more invested in Wall Street. And there's more direct financial interest linking the European bourgeoisie and the US bourgeoisie. They not only do they go to the same schools and they have the same ideology and think very much alike, and they have this, neoliberal imperialist view of neoliberal globalization and all of that, but their own economic interests are in the US. They're all invested in the US stock market, in the S&P 500, and the Magnificent Seven, and all these big tech corporations. Yanis Varoufakis has correctly, constantly emphasized that Europe does not have any of what he calls cloud capital. All of the big, massive monopolies in Silicon Valley that they control the digital infrastructure of the modern economy. Amazon, all of those companies, Europe does not have that. It's entirely dependent on the US. So the point I'm getting at is that even if you had a change in leadership, even if Jeremy Corbyn were allowed to come to power, and we see that obviously he was not allowed to, he was sabotaged, these economies, the capitalist class, they're all so deeply integrated with the US that even though Trump and JD Vance are spitting in their face and telling them they're stupid and telling them they have to pay the US, protection fees and whatever, like acting like a mafia leader, I still don't think that they're going to be able to actually to pursue a more independent path. I mean, Europe, I hate to be really pessimistic, especially for people watching from Europe, but I mean, it really looks like Europe is going to be in its own century of humiliation, as people are saying. I mean, they have been so subordinated to the United States that as the US is just going on this rampage around the world, Europe, their so-called allies, are going to be the one who suffer most. We started talking about Ukraine and how the US is imposing conditions on Ukraine that are even worse than the conditions imposed on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. So this is how the US treats its so-called friends and allies. Again, we need to go back to that famous Kissinger quote. To be an enemy of the US is dangerous. To be a friend of the US is fatal.
Yeah, and the absolute, I mean, the bullyism that the Trump administration has demonstrated just on the level of public relations has been embarrassing. And not to mention that everything the United States is doing now under Trump toward Europe, this idea of cutting Europe loose, all of it is actually making Europe even more dependent on the United States, because now Europe is saying, well, we have to become even more militarized than we already are. Well, how are they going to do that exactly? Their military-industrial complex pales in comparison to the United States and is very dependent on the United States. So
yeah, they're going to buy more weapons from the U.S. military industrial complex.
That's what the whole NATO pledge is, right? 2% was supposed to be a raise, and then now 5%. It's all about the weapons, and it's all about the money. And for Trump, a lot of people don't factor this in, shockingly, for someone who literally comes out of the business class, the capitalist class. It's about money. I mean, he says it to us. He says it's about money. We want to make more money. We want to get richer. We want to get stronger. Well, it's a good way to get rich is by forcing entire governments in Europe to become more dependent on your biggest revenue generator, the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Speaking of the military-industrial complex, Ben, I wanted to talk about this Ukraine rare earth. You've been talking about this economic colonialism of Ukraine, and I wanted to talk about this in the context, you probably remember back in December, in response to the semiconductor war that the Biden administration was waging, China hit back and imposed on critical minerals export restrictions amid what they call the escalating U.S.-China tech war. It's literally a U.S. tech war against China. But, CSIS, you've talked about this U.S. government-funded think tank, talks about how the restrictions double down on controls on metals, critical minerals, and that they are, of course, critical toward dual-use technology for civilian and military use. And they ban shipments of antimony, gallium, and germanium to the United States. It goes on to talk about the importance of these minerals for weapons production itself. And it's not as if the United States and the Western media are not talking about this. You brought up that article in the Telegraph. I found this headline to be interesting. Kiev holds 15 trillion in natural resources, which would break the U.S.'s dependence on China on these very same so-called rare earth minerals. But then Bloomberg, Ben, and so I want your understanding of this. Bloomberg then says that actually Ukraine doesn't have very many rare earth minerals, and shows this graph. Of course, China is by far, this is where China has a huge advantage in natural resources, some of the few that it has. And then, of course, it talks about, Russia, Vietnam, but, Ukraine isn't really on this graph in terms of rare earth. So what is the reality here? In particular, could you talk about this move by China? Because it was a big move. And I think it's so interesting that right after this move occurred, the Trump administration comes in and is very obsessed with getting a economic deal from Ukraine to obtain rare earth minerals itself, regardless of whether there's a basis to it or not. Your thoughts?
Yeah, this has been a huge issue for the U.S. This is, again, bipartisan. In fact, a few years ago, the U.S. Congress Committee on the Communist Party of China, they always say the CCP, but the official term is the Communist Party of China, the CPC. They published this report on fear-mongering about China's role in the global supply chain for rare earths and for other critical minerals. That's the term they use, critical minerals. These are minerals that are needed not only for, of course, renewable energy technology, electric vehicles, solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, but also for military technology. And that's the real concern for the U.S. Obviously, the U.S. is way behind China when it comes to renewable energy. China is leading the world by far with all renewable energy technology, not only with electric vehicles and solar panels and wind turbines and batteries, but also nuclear power, which is the cleanest, most effective form of energy. China and Russia also are major innovators and are developing a lot of nuclear power plants, not only in their countries, but in other countries. The U.S. is so behind. I mean, that's why the U.S. is trying to catch up, but they're not going to be able to for a variety of reasons. The U.S. is deindustrialized. Its economy is held together by duct tape and a bunch of crypto scams. I mean, the U.S. is just the U.S. has Wall Street and it has Silicon Valley, and then it just has the rest of the economy it consists of imports, really. The U.S., Trump has this idea he's going to reindustrialize. I think it would be a great idea for the U.S. to reindustrialize, but I don't think Trump's going to accomplish it. His policies are not going to accomplish it because you would have to take on the financial class. You would have to take on Wall Street, and he surrounded himself with those people. Trump's Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is a hedge fund billionaire, and there are 13 billionaires in the Trump administration. They're obsessed with keeping the huge stock market bubble afloat. And as soon as it pops, which is going to happen in the next year or two, they're going to reinflate it. So the U.S. is not going to reindustrialize. It would take a revolution for that to happen. But one thing that the U.S. is very concerned about is, even though they know they can't reindustrialize realistically, they're very concerned about China's role in the supply chain for military technology. Because obviously, if they're preparing for a war on China, which is bipartisan in Washington, they recognize that having China in the supply chain for their military technology means that if there's some kind of war, China could cut that all off. So they're trying to diversify. Greenland is seen as a potential opportunity. You showed that chart, and yes, Greenland, it's known that they have rare earth elements, but it's not a lot compared to especially China. However, those are just the known rare earths. And the same thing with Ukraine. The expectation is that there are, Ukraine is a very big country and it has a lot of minerals. So the expectation is that as they do more exploration, they will find rare earths and many other minerals. It's not just rare earth. It's also what are known as critical minerals. So these are Ukraine, as that article you pointed out earlier acknowledges in the Telegraph, they have trillions and trillions of dollars of minerals. And even the New York Times had this very long article about how the U.S. can use, so it's not just new, it's not just a new talking point. Back when Biden was leader, they said that the U.S., that Ukraine had all of these strategic minerals that the U.S. wanted to weaken their dependency on China. Because it's also, the thing about this chart, it's not just the reserves being in the country, right? It's also about the supply chain. Because even if there are rare earths or other critical minerals in another country, in order to actually process those, right? Because you don't just take them out of the ground and then put them in a battery. Exactly. They have to be processed. It's a very complicated process. And China is present at every single level of that supply chain. And the U.S. is deindustrialized because it wasn't profitable enough. All of these companies, these investors in the U.S., they were looking to maximize their return on investment. And the best way to do that was not to invest in the critical mineral supply chain. It was to spend over 90% of the net income of S&P 500 companies buying back their own stocks and paying out dividends. So the U.S. is really trying to catch up now. And actually, Marco Rubio, who's trying to rebrand himself, this is not just new. For a few years now, Rubio has tried to rebrand himself as the old traditional neocon to a right-wing populist. He's still a neocon, but he now uses different rhetoric. But he, a few years ago, his office published this long report, this long statement arguing in defense of industrial policy. That is government intervention in the economy to develop industry and to reindustrialize. And if you read the report, which I did, it's all about China, everything. From the beginning to the end, he says, China, 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 China. China controls the supply chain. We have to develop our own supply chain. China is the industrial superpower. We have to reindustrialize to stop China. So it's not real. I mean, like I always emphasize, this rhetoric about populism, this rhetoric about industrial policy and reindustrializing, it's half-baked. It's not real. It's all motivated by the new Cold War and the attempt to weaken China. So the U.S. thinks Ukraine, I mean, obviously, and then the other element for Ukraine is simply money. Trump is saying, look, we gave you $100 billion. You have to pay us back $500 billion. Because as Trump says, America first, everyone else last. We have to win. Everyone else has to lose. You know, China has a very different view. China advocates what it calls win-win cooperation and mutual benefit. Trump has the exact opposite view. It's zero-sum game. We win. Everyone else loses. We take at least 50%, as he said, of Ukraine's revenue from oil, gas, and minerals exports. And, you know, Greenland is also very similar. He wants to get control of Greenland's minerals. Part of it, again, as Marco Rubio said, it's about controlling the Arctic, turning the Arctic into a U.S. sphere of influence and preventing China from getting access to the Arctic. As Marco Rubio said blatantly in his interview with Megyn Kelly, he did not hide it. But it's also about these minerals.
Ben, what's your take on, you know, the actual impact here on this very question of these minerals, especially with regard to China taking this position of, hitting the United States around the export of these critical resources that these weapons manufacturers really need those things to be processed and then utilized for the military industrial complex. So what do you make of the possible impact here? Because as you just said, China, and this is true of almost everything in world economic production, China is everywhere in the supply chain, including in this critical arena. What do you believe the impact is then on the U.S. military itself? You know, the U.S. military regime as the armed body of the empire has been exposed in Ukraine dramatically. And it's been exposed in many other areas too, in terms of its capacity to be able to use its military apparatus to actually wage wars that lead to its sphere of influence expanding and being able to, for example, like in Ukraine, to achieve political and military objectives. So what do you make overall of this direction for the U.S. military as the armed body of the empire, now that China's economic influence is so great that it's even affecting this part? I mean, it was simply a response, I think a very good one, to a tech war that is led and facilitated by the United States solely. There's no tech war for China. Your thoughts?
They're very concerned. Let's be real. The U.S. military is very concerned because this for them is seen as a so-called national security problem, because they're preparing for conflict, some kind of conflict with China. And the U.S. is deindustrialized. It is not a major I mean, people will say, okay, well, you know, the U.S. is the second largest manufacturer in the world after China. But first of all, look, what does the U.S. produce? It's mostly military. I mean, and a lot of what's considered U.S. manufacturing is really done in other countries and maybe assembled in the U.S. or with intellectual property owned in the U.S. What we're seeing today is the outcome of this is the end result of the neoliberal policies that were pursued by the U.S. for decades under Republicans and Democrats. And what happened is that the U.S. capitalist class in the 70s and 80s recognized that technology had developed that made the mobility of capital much easier. They could move capital all around the world quickly with digital technology, and then eventually with the internet. I mean, now it's immediate. This is why you have, bank runs used to take a few days or weeks, whereas now look what happened to Silicon Valley Bank. You have a bank run basically in one day because it's all digital. You just withdraw everything in your bank and your website from your bank, right? So capital has become extremely mobile. And as that happened, neoliberal globalization led to de-industrialization of the US, as US capitalists voluntarily, they chose to do this, moved their factories to other countries because they wanted to exploit lower paid workers. And then, of course, entire supply chains were developed outside of the United States. Then the cost of production became prohibitively expensive in the US because the capitalist class bought up all of the assets and pumped up these huge bubbles that, we saw, of course, the dot-com bubble, but then we saw a huge real estate bubble that briefly burst in 2008. And then what happened ever since? The real estate bubble that burst in 2008 has been inflated to even higher levels. The stock market is in the biggest bubble in history, even bigger than the dot-com bubble as a percentage of GDP, well over 200% of GDP. And there's now something known as the everything bubble in the US. So what we're seeing today is the logical conclusion of that system. This is also why inequality has exploded in the US. It's why so many people are struggling. They can't afford housing because the US has become this financialized, deindustrialized society where a small handful of corporate oligarchs control everything. And the largest landlord is Blackstone, which has 300,000 housing units. And they continue to buy up more and more every single year. So in that system that the US created, and now they're angry about it because China has become the world's industrial superpower, like the US was in the early 20th century. China is now the world's leading industrial power. So Trump is desperately trying to change that system. But again, as we talked about earlier, he has these totally contradictory views. So, for instance, I think it would be great to reindustrialize. I don't think Trump will accomplish it because you have to take on Wall Street to do so, but it would be great. The US should. It needs to reindustrialize. I think it would be great for the US to significantly bring down the US dollar, to depreciate the US dollar, and to make to end the US dollar as the global reserve currency. But Trump's not saying that. He's saying that he wants to weaken the dollar, but also he wants to keep the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And he's threatening tariffs on countries that de-dollarize, which is actually strengthening the dollar. So he has these totally contradictory views that are not going to work. And really what he's recognizing is that there is this real issue of deindustrialization and financialization, but he can't actually take the policies that would be needed to solve the problem because they would conflict with all of his other priorities of serving Wall Street and expanding US imperial power. And China, on the other hand, China is in so much of a stronger position than the former Soviet Union was. This is why these people in the West who think that China's a day from falling, this whole nonsense we've heard from Gordon Chang for over a decade of China's going to collapse. It's so laughable. The US is in a much more precarious situation. The US is still very powerful, but economically, it's in a much more precarious situation than China is. China produces everything. It has the entire global supply chain. China is dealing with issues. It popped a real estate bubble with youth unemployment. It's transitioning its economy from infrastructure-led growth to high tech growth. It's doing all these things. But the point is that the US's economy is in a very dire situation. And there's so much propaganda in the West about US exceptionalism, the economy doing well. The fact that Trump won is a testament to the fact that many people in the US feel that they're not doing well economically. Trump basically won because of inflation under Biden. And most incumbent leaders around the world who were incumbent during the inflation following the pandemic supply chain shocks, most of them lost the election. So if you look at the Washington Post did an exit poll, and they found that 2/3 of voters said that the economy was the most important issue for them. And Trump campaigned on the economy. He said, I'm going to bring down inflation. I'm going to make eggs affordable. I'm going to tariff other countries, and that's going to magically solve inflation, which it's not going to do, by the way. It actually could make inflation even worse. But the point is, and actually inflation is creeping back up now. But the point is that the reason I answered this question more broadly than your question about the military is that the military is one part of this. Like the U.S. has created this world. The U.S. oversaw neoliberal globalization, starting, of course, under Reagan, going into Bill Clinton. This was bipartisan. The U.S. created this world, and now China has become the industrial superpower, and the U.S. is trying to reindustrialize, but it can't. And that's why instead it's focusing on what they see as their main national security interest, which is the military. So they say, okay, fine, we're not going to realistically be able to reindustrialize. So at the very least, we need to kick out China from the supply chain for our military technology. That's what they're really focusing on now. And maybe they can accomplish that. But I think what's really going to happen is, despite all of the tariffs and all of that, what we're actually seeing is what's known as friend-shoring or near-shoring. So the U.S. is trying to the U.S. is trying to pressure U.S. companies to move their investments in China and out of China, and to increase them in friends in countries that are closer, like Mexico, even Vietnam, which is very funny because Vietnam is very much the next China. They're going through what Vietnam's going through now is like what China was going through in the 90s. So, like I said, the U.S. is not going to be able to accomplish this, but they're trying.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you said, it truly and really is all about China. I think this is hard for a lot of people to understand, even in the area of Ukraine's rare earths. All of this is about, there's this notion, Ben, that the United States will like decouple from China. And I can see already that the Trump administration, through this reliance on tariffs as as an economic policy, uh, is still right on board with this idea of decoupling, because the whole idea is for the United States' tariffs to bring back industries that are supposedly doing business everywhere else, including in China. They won't want to do it in China because the tariffs or duties are so high. They'll come back to the United States and do it in the United States. Donald Trump even said, "Oh, there's a big tech company coming back to the United States." A lot of people were saying, "It's Apple. It's Apple. Apple's coming back to the United States." But all this is to say, Ben, is there is this push for the Trump administration around this trade war, which has just gotten started. It's very early still in the Trump administration, but it's likely, with the tariff threats on BRICS as a whole. China already has 10% levied. That seems like a lowball number given Trump's history.
An additional 10%,
right?
10% plus the previous
from the yes, exactly. And it seems like who knows how much these tariffs will escalate. And you mentioned eggs being cheaper coming up. Not true at all. I know you're not here in the United States, Ben, but you can't get a cheap dozen eggs anywhere if you can find them. So the United States is in an real economic decline. It's a real economic difficulties. But talk about, if you could, the trade war and how you believe this will continue to transpire based on what we've already seen from the Trump administration and its logical conclusions.
Yeah, I think we'll see less direct trade between the U.S. and China, but more indirect trade. This is what we've already seen in the past decade. Let's not forget that Trump started the trade war against China in 2016, and then Biden came in and he continued it. Biden was a little more targeted. Biden's tariffs were against specific critical industries, strategic industries, especially semiconductors, new energy. China calls them new energy vehicles, electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels. So those are the Biden tariffs, but Trump's tariffs are blanket tariffs mostly, although he also targets certain industries. So what we saw in the past decade is that China's total exports to the U.S. decreased as an overall percentage, but the gross number actually increased. This is what's very funny. It's not talked about a lot. Despite the Trump tariffs and the Biden tariffs, China is exporting more to the U.S. today than it was a decade ago in terms of the gross number, the overall number. However, the point is that China's trade overall has increased, and the trade with the U.S. as a percentage has decreased. So a decade ago, it was 22% of Chinese exports went to the U.S. Now it's about 15%. I expect that number to keep going down. And instead, what we're going to see is, as I mentioned, friend-shoring and near-shoring. We're going to see other countries. China will reroute the exports to other countries. Maybe that country will have they'll be involved in the supply chain. They'll add value to that process, and then they'll export it to the U.S. And then they can say it was made in Vietnam or made in Mexico or wherever, right? So trade with the US-China trade will continue, but more indirectly. Ironically, that also makes products more expensive for US consumers. But at the end of the day, it's going to be US consumers who lose out. Let's be real here. I want to emphasize this point. What is a tariff? A tariff is a tax on imported consumption. It's a tax on imports, but really it's a tax on consumption. So Trump, we were talking about this earlier. Trump said he's going to make a deal with China and Russia to have the military budget. It's never going to happen. It's like he said he was going to force Mexico to pay for the wall. It never happened. He also said, falsely, that other countries pay for tariffs. That's not true. It's objectively false. Who pays for tariffs? Importers pay for tariffs. So when US companies import products from China, the retailers maybe they will eat part of that cost of the tariff and they'll reduce their profit margin slightly. But at the end of the day, consumers will likely pay a higher price. So what does this mean? It means that average working people, especially the poorest Americans, will have to pay more of their paycheck, and many of them are living paycheck to paycheck, on imported consumer goods. And that means that they will basically pay higher taxes, while Trump is going to cut taxes on the rich further and cut taxes on corporations. So what we actually see, and this is why I said Trump has a lot in common with Reagan. So what we're actually seeing is, it's just Reaganism 2.0, destroying the welfare state, cutting social spending, and then also cutting taxes on the rich and cutting taxes on corporations and increasing tariffs. You know, Reagan is seen as a free trader, but actually Ronald Reagan put 100% tariffs on Japanese electronic products in 1987. So there is so much in common between Trump and Reagan. And what I'm really saying is that Trump's policy is increasing taxes on workers and decreasing taxes on capital. Increased taxes on labor, decreased taxes on the rich. So in terms of China and its trade with the US, China now trades more with ASEAN, Southeast Asia, than with any other region. And China trades more with BRICS countries than it does with the US, the UK, and the EU. So, I mean, overall, what we've seen, if you look at a chart of China's trade dependency on the West, it's decreasing over time. This has been over a decade. I think that trend will continue. But this idea of decoupling is still, it's fake, because China is still trading, like I said, gross more with the US than it was before. And a lot of that trade is indirect. So Trump says he's going to put all these tariffs on everywhere. What we've actually seen is, he threatened these tariffs on Mexico and Canada of 25%, and then he temporarily suspended them. I expect that throughout Trump's term, we'll see a lot of these kinds of policies. He'll threaten very high tariffs. He'll backtrack. He'll put tariffs on that are actually smaller than what he says. So, I mean, I think he's recognizing that the U.S., you can't, one final point. He's recognizing that tariffs are not a panacea. He thinks they are, but they're not. He's actually using tariffs more as a diplomatic tool, as a threat, as a geopolitical weapon, than he's using them as an actual tool of industrial policy. Because if you actually want to reindustrialize the U.S., tariffs can be part of that. I'm actually not against tariffs. We talked about this. I'm certainly not a free trader. I mean, people on the left should not be free traders. Free trade benefits the capitalists on Wall Street. But I mean, in reality, tariffs can be used selectively. Now, I'm against blanket tariffs. That's a really stupid idea, because Trump says he's going to tariff everything. Well, is the U.S. going to make a bunch of factories that create textiles, T-shirts, hoodies, shoes? I highly doubt it. Those would cost $200. Like, it's not going to happen. The blanket tariffs are stupid. I mean, by the way, you know how much food the U.S. imports from Mexico? If he puts blanket tariffs on food exports from Mexico, then U.S. food in grocery stores, there will be massive inflation. So that's a really stupid idea. However, tariffs have always been used as a tool of industrial policy to protect infant industries, to develop your own domestic manufacturing capabilities in strategic industries. Ironically, this is what Biden did. He said, we're going to tariff Chinese EVs and we're going to make our own EVs. Well, there aren't that many US EVs being made, and they're way more expensive and they're worse than Chinese EVs, but at least they tried. So the point that I'm getting at is that tariffs are not a panacea. They're part of a much larger industrial policy. What does it also mean? It means you have to invest heavily in research and development. What is Trump and Elon Musk doing? The opposite. They're slashing scientific research and spending on universities. I mean, this is going to be a huge blow to U.S. industrial production and manufacturing capabilities. So you need R&D. You need to train technical workers because, you have in generations now since the end of, since de-industrialization and the offshoring of all these factories in Detroit and Cleveland. My family's from Cleveland. Like, there are people in my family who worked in the car plants and they lost their jobs. You have generations now. These are like grandparents, my grandparents, like generation. They've lost that job and they've lost those skills for decades. They can't just magically go back to a factory. First of all, making the factories is very complex because, again, we were talking about the supply chain. You have to have, where are you going to get all of your materials from? Not only the raw materials, but all of the imports, all of the inputs. So when you build a car, you have to have all of the engine parts, all of the other parts, all of the metal working. You have to have all of the tires. Where are all of those inputs going to come from? You can't just magically do it all domestically. There's a very complex global supply chain. In fact, look at China, Canada and Mexico. So Canada and Mexico do produce cars. And in fact, there are reports that the average car that's produced crosses the border between US and Mexico and the US and Canada 7 times in the production process. These are very complex supply chains. You can't just magically put on tariffs. You have to train technical workers, build the factories, create an entire domestic supply chain, and then the government has to invest in infrastructure. US infrastructure is falling apart. I mean, it's horrible. It's some of the worst infrastructure of all the rich countries. And yet, if you want to create advanced manufacturing, you need very good infrastructure. So, I mean, and there's the whole energy grid. Trump says he wants to drill, baby, drill. But then the energy grid itself has to be updated because a lot of the US energy grid is already operating at capacity. And if you're running a plant, if you're manufacturing, you need a lot of energy. And if your electrical grid is already at capacity, you have to build a new electrical grid. You have to expand it. I mean, there are so many elements here in which the state, I mean, look at what China did, but not just China, South Korea, Taiwan province, look at what Japan did, all of these East Asian countries. This idea that they just magically had a free market industrialized is a joke. It's laughable. All of their industrialization was led by the state, by state-owned enterprises, by massive state investment in infrastructure and education. Trump is doing the opposite of that. He's cutting all of the government spending and all of the programs and saying tariffs will magically solve the problem, which they will not.
No, yeah, and Ben, maybe we can close on this. I wanted to ask your opinion on the lessons of, you cover geopolitical economy. What are the geopolitical economic, if we use the term geopolitical economy, the lessons we can learn from this transition? Because I think a lot of people in the audience here have demonstrated that massive political change in the United States, even when it's not massive in the sense of, let's say, conditions changing on the ground in the United States, but when there is a massive political transition, like, let's say, moving from a Biden to a Trump, when there is this flurry, which is very true for most administrations, the first 100 days are generally a time to establish yourself. But when you see there was an impetus, I think your Nixon comparison is very interesting because Nixon also came into office in a kind of crisis situation, both domestically and abroad. But we just look at the abroad situation, the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese were winning and kicking the butts of the United States. And Nixon was supposed to go in there as a realist and ended. And we saw what happened actually under Nixon. Many more Vietnamese, Cambodian, Lao people died. And were killed. So all this is to say is that I think for me, the lesson is that Donald Trump has come in. You mentioned the economic reality that led him to win the election. Also, the Gaza situation, the genocide, huge factor, which now is being acknowledged by polls as well, that Biden around Gaza in his role in the genocide was a big deal breaker. So he comes in, he does he gets the ceasefire in place or plays a role in getting Biden's old May ceasefire into place. And then Trump now addresses Ukraine, which also is a big political problem for the U.S. Ruling class right now, as in terms of its legitimacy. One of the reasons Biden also lost was because that conflict was becoming increasingly unpopular. So for me, the lesson is that Donald Trump, I think a lot of people are looking at Donald Trump's bluster and his bravado and his firm political takes as a huge transition, when in my assessment, this transition is really more about the conditions that are pushing Donald Trump and his administration to make certain moves. And my word of caution is that these moves are not some kind of, use the word panacea. To me, they're not like a panacea for peace. And the U.S. is becoming some kind of new player in the multipolar world. It's going to pursue peace where it is necessary, and it's going to play a more beneficial role in the world. Actually, in my opinion, it's really about retreating in one area in order to prepare for where the U.S. is looking to exert its dominance in the very near future. We're not talking about years from now. We're talking about weeks to months, because they're all saying foreign policy has to be within the U.S.'s national security interests. And I urge people to ask the question, what the hell does that even mean? We hear this. How long have we heard this? That anything that the United States does has to be within the realm of U.S. national security. What national security is being protected? Who is threatening the United States? The biggest threat to the United States is those who rule the United States. From the egg prices to the surveillance state to all of it, that's the big threat. And for me, the big lesson here is that the empire is reorienting. We don't exactly know. We can't see right now some kind of new policies, additions, but everything that's happened in Trump's administration now, even just now, and everything that's happened before him shows that there's a big there's a big need for the empire to shift. If it doesn't, it will experience, in my opinion, one of the biggest defeats militarily that it has ever experienced in Ukraine. Some people would argue it already has. But if it keeps going and there's no stopping to the fighting, eventually Ukraine will reach the logical conclusion of being totally defeated, and the U.S. will take credit for that. And it'll be Trump's war. So for me, Ben, that's the lesson, is that there are conditions that are just pushing these developments. They're happening very rapidly. And just a word of caution that this doesn't mean that the empire has changed it hasn't bowed down to the principles of peace and international law. It is simply looking for a new form, maybe a new rebrand of how it does its dealings. Your thoughts. I'll give you the floor for the last part of this show.
Yeah, you use the perfect term, strategic retreat. I think that's exactly what we're seeing. The U.S. recognized that they lost in Ukraine. I mean, I was even saying before the election that regardless of who wins, they're going to have to end the war, even if it's, Biden or Harris. Of course, I think it would have been very different with Biden or Harris. They wouldn't have had direct talks with Russia like what we're seeing now, but they would have had to have some kind of cessation of hostilities, and it would be an indirect acknowledgement that they lost, because they have lost the war on the ground. They have lost. They cannot win. Even if the war continues for a few months or a year, who knows, they have lost. Now, we were talking about the comparisons to Nixon, and you raised a great point about how Nixon was it's not about just his individual policies, but about the historical context, the material conditions within which Nixon was governing. Trump is a good example of that. We're in this watershed moment in the world. As President Xi Jinping says, we are seeing changes in the world not seen in 100 years. He's repeated that many times, and I think he's absolutely right. That what we're seeing is, I already talked about how the U.S. designed the international financial system in a way that put the dollar at the center, and the U.S. capitalist class voluntarily deindustrialized and financialized the economy because it made them much richer, but it created all of these problems we're talking about now with, the U.S. having no supply chain domestically and being entirely dependent on China, and now trying to securitize, as they say, the supply chain and create alternatives, and Trump trying to reduce U.S. trade with China and forcing Europe to buy more weapons from the U.S. and all of this. But I think another part of this is that other countries are it's not just the US and China and Russia. Like this is the way that Marco Rubio sees the world, right? And Trump, they see the world as imperial spheres of influence with great powers, and all the small countries just get bossed around, and the US can colonize whoever it wants, and Greenland, Gaza, and Panama, and whatever. That's not what's actually happening. There are many other countries in the world that are not just sitting there taking orders. They're also seeking alternatives. We were talking about BRICS. This is what's so important about BRICS. This is why so many countries in the global south want to join BRICS, because they are seeking alternatives. For 51 years now, the countries of the global south have demanded a new international economic order. And what we're seeing is early signs of that. I don't think it's going to happen in 1 year or 2 years. I think we're going to see it in 10, 20, 30 years. But we're seeing an entirely new international financial structure being created. And Trump is actually part of this. You know, he's trying to save it, but he's also destroying it at the same time. Like we're talking about his completely contradictory policies. He wants to weaken the dollar to reindustrialize, but he wants to threaten countries that de-dollarize. But it's pretty much inevitable. This system is falling apart, just like it was falling apart when Richard Nixon came in. And of course, it was the economist Michael Hudson, a huge influence on me, friend of the show, who showed this back in the 70s with his famous book, Super Imperialism. How after World War II, the U.S. was even before World War II, the U.S. was the world's leading industrial power. But after World War II, the U.S. was responsible for over 40% of world GDP and a majority of world manufacturing production, because all of its industrial competitors had been destroyed in World War II. Europe was destroyed, Japan was destroyed, the Soviet Union was destroyed, China was destroyed. The U.S. was basically fine. And not only was the U.S. not destroyed, but World War II was a huge economic boom to the U.S. And that really pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression. And then the U.S. created the Marshall Plan to provide the liquidity to Europe that was needed to pay for imports, because the U.S. was exporting a lot, and you need dollars to pay for those exports. So the Marshall Plan gave Europe the money needed to pay for U.S. exports, and it also prevented Europe from becoming communist and allying with the Soviet Union. Look at countries like Italy and France. They had huge communist parties that were very popular and would have likely won the election if it were not for CIA meddling. The first CIA operation was in 1948 in Italy to rig the election against the Communist Party and the Socialists, and to steal the election on behalf of the right wing in Italy. So, and France was very similar. So then what happened is, as Michael Hudson showed, the US started creating this global empire. It waged the Korean War starting in 1950, and then it took over the French Empire's role in Southeast Asia and started the Vietnam War. And as Michael Hudson showed, after World War II, the US had a current account surplus. It was exporting a lot to the rest of the world. But because of all of the money that was spending waging war in Asia, the US began, its current account surplus began falling, and eventually began running a current account deficit. What does that mean? It started importing more than it was exporting. And then it started importing more and more and more and more and more and more, until the US was running out of gold and had to end the link of the dollar to gold in 1971. It was Richard Nixon who did that. Nixon was the one who recognized that the US was in this situation. They had to fundamentally change the situation in the world. And then what he do? He replaced the link of the dollar to gold with oil, and had a de facto, instead of the dollar being backed by gold, it was de facto backed by oil. And then Kissinger and Nixon's Treasury Secretary went to Saudi Arabia, and they forced Saudi Arabia to sign an agreement in which the US would protect Saudi Arabia in return for Saudi Arabia selling its oil in gold, which maintained global demand for dollars. Excuse me, I misspoke. Pressuring Saudi Arabia to sell its oil in dollars, not gold, in dollars, which maintained global demand for dollars, and was a way of bringing down inflation as an attempt, but also a way of maintaining the global demand for dollars despite the end of the link to gold. Why do I talk about all that history? Because I think Trump is kind of in a similar situation. It's clear that this system is falling apart, and BRICS countries, which now represent 55% of the world population, are creating an alternative. They're not only seeking an alternative, they are actively creating an alternative as we speak. Last year, at the 2024 BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia, all BRICS members endorsed a historic document that calls for transforming the international monetary and financial system. And there are many different aspects of that they are pursuing. Trump can see that. That's why he's threatening BRICS with 100% tariffs, right? And there's talk about Trump and Scott Besson. Scott Besson was asked about this in an interview, and he said that they're going to remake Bretton Woods. He wants to be part of that. They want to remake Bretton Woods. And they're talking about something they call the Mar-a-Lago Accords, based on what Reagan did. This is why I say Trump is like a combination of Nixon and Reagan. Reagan famously had the Plaza Accords because the dollar was very overvalued due to it's very complicated, but due to the shock in starting in 1979, going into the early 1980s under Volcker, where the U.S. had all this inflation, so he massively raised interest rates in the Federal Reserve, which overvalued the dollar. Other currencies fell against the dollar. Interest rates were very high. We're in a situation today that's pretty similar. The dollar is very overvalued. Trump wants to bring it down. Interest rates are very high. Trump wants to bring down interest rates. He wants to have a deal they call the Mar-a-Lago Accords based on the Plaza Accords. By the way, the Plaza Accords doomed the Japanese economy by significantly overvaluing the Japanese yen, which hurt the competitiveness of Japanese exports. It caused the financialization of the Japanese economy and a huge real estate bubble and a financial bubble. Japan never really recovered from that. But Trump wants to do a Mar-a-Lago Accord. And the question is, what countries will he force to do this? Probably Europe, probably Japan again, probably South Korea, all of the countries in the U.S. sphere of influence. He would like to do it to China, but China is way too smart. They will never do that. So I think in many ways, to understand Trump, we have to study what happened under Nixon. And I do expect some changes that happen, but it's not because of Trump as a person individually. It's because the U.S. is in a situation internationally where the system it created has reached its death. It's reached its end. The neoliberal globalization, all of what we were talking about, the system has clearly reached its sell-by date. And Trump is trying to usher in something a bit different, like Nixon did in 1971.
Yeah. No, I mean, this all goes back to, I mean, we could also I arguably trace it, Ben, to this. A lot of people trace it to the advent of neoliberalism in the 1980s as the beginning of the decline of U.S. empire and capitalism. But I actually trace it to that end, the end of the Vietnam War period, that period that Nixon actually came into, which could very well be at the beginning, even if the consequences were more apparent afterward. But there was one question from the audience, maybe quickly if you wanted to take it. It's from Emblemed Fates. When do you think Trump will / the U.S. will ramp up regime change efforts in the new left AES alliance in Africa? Oh, okay. I see. In Africa, and how do you envision they'll interfere?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say. Trump, of course, has a very chauvinistic, racist view of Africa. He called them shithole countries. And he famously said that he doesn't really care about Africa. When he was president the first time, he never visited Africa. Now, that doesn't mean that the U.S. won't, pursue interventionist policies in Africa. They always do. In fact, the fact that he doesn't even care about Africa could be even worse, because he'll just let AFRICOM and the CIA do whatever they want in Africa and run rampant and try to overthrow independent governments. So, yeah, I mean, I'm pretty concerned about that. And this is a reference also to the Sahel, that in Western and in Africa and the Sahel region, there are these new governments that came to power that are revolutionary nationalist governments, very anti-imperialist, in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and they're even expanding. There are a lot of exciting things happening there. They're trying to industrialize. They're trying to assert more control over their natural resources. The Financial Times had a hilarious article. Of course, the FT speaks on behalf of the transatlantic capitalist class. They had a hilarious article complaining about how foreign investors in the mining industry in those countries were losing out on their mining investments, even though in the same article they acknowledge that these are some of the poorest countries in the world. But there are a lot of interesting things happening. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely concerned about U.S. meddling there. Although I have to say that what I'm most concerned about, which really keeps me up at night, is U.S. meddling in Latin America. Because Trump has made this very clear. He invoked manifest destiny in his inauguration speech. People around him are invoking the Monroe Doctrine. They did that during his first term. Let's not forget that Trump backed the coup attempt in Venezuela. He backed a coup attempt in Nicaragua. He backed a successful coup in Bolivia. I think that they're going to be really aggressive in Latin America. We're already seeing this with the Panama Canal. We're already seeing this with Mexico. I think he's going to invade Mexico. I'm not joking. I'm not saying like hundreds of thousands of troops, like Afghanistan style, but they're going to send troops into Mexico. They've been talking about this in violation of the sovereignty of Mexico. The Mexican government says they oppose this. And, you know, they're threatening Panama. In a press conference, Trump was asked if he would use military force, and he said he refused to rule it out, to take the Panama Canal. And I'm really concerned also with the election coming up in Brazil. There are so many things that could happen. Like the situation in Latin America is very precarious. I've talked to a lot of people who are really concerned about even more explicit U.S. meddling. It never ends. You know, under Biden, it continued. But, you know, let's keep in mind that we talk about how there are a lot of commonalities between Republicans and Democrats. But typically, of course, Democrats also support coup attempts and meddling in Latin America. But Republicans tend to be even more explicitly open in their interventionism. Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada. It was George Bush Sr., who invaded Grenada. Of course, the Contra War in Nicaragua, the terror death squads backed by the CIA under Reagan. I mean, so I think that's, and Marco Rubio, the fact that he was chosen as Secretary of State is a sign that the U.S. is prioritizing imposing its imperial sphere of influence in Latin America. It's just blatant colonialism. And what was the first trip that Marco Rubio took as Secretary of State? He went to Panama. And then he forced Panama to withdraw from China's Belt and Road Initiative. And after that, he went to El Salvador, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic. So yeah, I think in Africa, I'm concerned, but I'm really concerned about Latin America.
Yeah, same here. Africa, I mean, U.S. militarization will continue, but it likely won't be an emphasis unless something different, something changes about that. Maybe not in U.S. control. But Ben, we've been on for 2 hours. I know you got a big day ahead of you. I have a big evening ahead of me of sleep, so we can end here. I have your channel in the video description, so everyone can go there and subscribe and follow Ben's work, Geopolitical Economy Report. You all should hit the like button in order to keep the stream boosted as we depart here. That would be very much appreciated. And I will be with all of you again soon. Thanks to everyone. Thanks for all of the super chats. I didn't get to acknowledge all of them, but let me do that now. So I'll just put them on the screen. Thank you, Monzer. Thank you, Voltaire. Thank you, Sparky. Thank you, Time Traveler. Sparky, you gave 2, so thanks for that. 3, actually. So there we go. Thanks so much, everybody. And take good care. And I'll be back again soon. Keep a lookout for announcements, and bye-bye.